I understand that one major concern of yours in running a successful company, especially in the current economic climate, is the question of worker loyalty. Are you saying that such a thing no longer exists? And if so, what are some of the reasons for this? And how important is loyalty to the smooth and successful running of a company such as yours?
Well, I do think it's important, but I also realise that we can't go back to the old-fashioned sense of loyalty where an employee would spend his whole working life with one company or business. Our grandparents, even our parents' generation, expected long-term employment, and their loyalty was rewarded with health care and a pension. This is no longer the case. Many companies are no longer willing or perhaps even able to provide such a financial package. Besides, to a younger generation, sticking at the same job all your life isn't a very exciting or inspiring prospect. Some reasons for this might be the shortening of contracts, outsourcing, automation, and people holding down more than one job. In other words, we've all had to adapt to the realities of a rapidly changing, fast-paced economy. However, all this is not to say that loyalty is dead. Rather, it has changed emphasis. Today, it is more about trust, in that an employee will promise to bring his skills and engage fully in his work for as long as she or he is there. People change jobs a lot more these days, but I still believe that a company is better off with at least a core of people who stay for the long term.
Within most developed countries, notions of pragmatism, notions of the fact that we have democracies, have succeeded in tempering the market economy. In the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution has a very negative effect on people, particularly working classes all over the world. We see data where life expectancy was reduced, hikes we were reduced, we were looking at the medical record. We can see that actually, living standards, much among large fractions of the population, actually went down. But eventually, we passed the legislation about working conditions. And we circumscribed some of the worst kinds of behavior. We eventually, in the 20th century, we put regulations that composed better environmental conditions. And so some of the damage was reversed, and that we have made the market economy work, and ways that the benefits of the all is far more what we shared in the world 100 years ago.
Did anyone happen to catch the American Metropolis last night? It was about the growth of cities.
I didn't see that, but I did see part of a documentary last week that told about a guy, I think he was a visitor from another country, who wrote a book about the growth of industry and so on, the things we've just studied. I remember he said there was a huge population explosion that turned America into a nation of cities all within a decade. He was talking mostly about Baltimore.
Baltimore then or now?
In the 19th century, right after the Civil War.
The program you saw was part of the same series as the one I want to tell you about. Last night the topic was New York City. As early as 1880, the federal government wrote a report on how the 5 separate municipalities of New York actually constituted one vast metropolitan area. It was a progressive way of thinking at the time, and within 20 years, those 5 municipalities were officially united as a single city by a vote of the people. To this day, however, each borough maintains traces of its original independence.
I agree with that. I'm from Brooklyn, and it's definitely different from the rest of New York.
Because of their protected status, a lot of bears have lost their fear of people. This may make them appear tame, but they're still potentially very dangerous. Bears are wild animals. 1 or 2 bear attacks occur each year in Glacier Park. The majority of attacks occur because people have surprised the bear.
What should we do if we surprise a bear?
You should try to avoid encounters in the first place by being alert and make noise, talk loud, holler. Bears will usually move out of the way if they hear people approaching.
Some people say to carry bells or put bells on your pack.
Most bells, even the so-called bear bells, are not loud enough. Calling out or clapping hands at regular intervals are better ways to make your presence known.
But isn't it kind of rude to make a lot of noise in the woods? I mean, people go there for peace and quiet.
In bear country, noise is good for you. Hiking quietly endangers you, the bear, and other hikers. People sometimes assume they don't have to make noise while hiking on a well-used trail. Some of the most frequently used trails in Glacier Park are surrounded by excellent bear habitat. You can't predict when and where bears might appear along a trail.
That's for sure. I remember my surprise when a black bear charged me. It must have been running away from hikers who surprised it on the trail ahead of me.
Don't assume a bear's hearing is any better than your own. Some trail conditions make it hard for bears to see, hear, or smell approaching hikers. You should be especially careful near streams, against the wind, or in dense vegetation. Stay with your group and, if possible, avoid hiking early in the morning, late in the day, or after dark, when bears are more likely to be active. Bears spend a lot of time eating, so avoid hiking in areas like berry patches or fields of glacier lilies.
How will the bear act if we surprise it?
Bears react differently to each situation. They may appear to tolerate you and then attack without warning. The most important advice I can give you is never to approach a bear intentionally.
No matter whether we live in the country, the suburbs, or the city, we come in contact with forests every day. A combination of trees, other plants, insects, wildlife, soil, water, air, and people is a forest. I'm a professional forester. That means I've been trained in the management of forests. Managing a forest is both a science and an art, which is why my education included courses in the biological, physical, and social sciences, as well as the humanities.
Doesn't being a forester mean you always work in the woods?
Foresters, of course, do work in the woods. More and more, however, they also work in laboratories, classrooms, planning agencies, corporate offices, and so forth. In fact, our professional organization, the Society of American Foresters, lists over 700 job categories.
I've always been confused about the difference between a national park and a national forest. In a lot of ways, they're similar. For example, we can camp and hike in both.
There is a difference between them. National parks, such as Yellowstone, are set aside and preserved in a near-natural state, mainly for the recreational enjoyment of the public. Our parks are administered by the Department of the Interior. National forests, on the other hand, are administered by the Department of Agriculture. Our forests are managed for their many benefits, including recreation, wood products, wildlife, and water.
That means there's a difference between a forester and a park ranger, right?
Yes, there are differences. A forester manages an area of forest for forest products, water quality, wildlife, recreation, and so on. A park ranger, on the other hand, manages an area in a national or state park, mainly for recreation. Another difference is who owns the land. A forester can work on federal, state, or private land, while a park ranger is almost always a government employee.
My major is biology, but I'd like to work in the woods, in the area of wildlife preservation. Would that make me a forester or a biologist?
Some foresters are primarily biologists, but most foresters majored in forestry management. Foresters and wildlife biologists often work together as a team. Both foresters and biologists want to see that various types of habitat flourish. Deer, for example, require a different habitat than wolves, yet the forest can accommodate them both.
Okay, class. Today we will talk about Roman doctors at the beginning of the 1st century. As we noted in our previous class, there was a 15-year-long war after Julius Caesar was assassinated. The war was severe. The number of injured was so many. There were so many that it became one of the top priorities of the new emperor to give medical care to those in need. It was around this time that the new emperor, Augustus, started thinking about upgrading the status of doctors. He realized that medical care was key to the empire and especially an army. In order to improve the medical system, he needed better doctors. So he started making the profession look more enticing. All army doctors were entitled to attend the new army medical school and were given dignified titles, land grants, and special retirement benefits. Before this, doctors had a fairly low status.
If you are unsure of drawing directly in pen and ink, start off with a light pencil sketch. This will allow you to make sure that your proportions are correct and that you are happy with the composition. Take a few minutes to study your subject, this chair and violin. Notice how the straight lines of the chair differ from the curves of the violin. Once you are ready to begin drawing, define the shape of the chair with clean straight lines. Then add contrast by drawing the outline of the violin with gently curved lines. You may have to apply more pressure to the nib when drawing curved lines to allow the ink to flow easily. When you have drawn the outlines of both objects,
The origins of jazz are as richly textured as the music itself. The term jazz really covers many different kinds of music. In the late 19th century, African Americans began performing the folk music known as the blues, whose origins lay in the work songs of slavery days. Within the African American community, the blues evolved into popular commercial music. In 1914, a black orchestra leader named W.C. Handy wrote the St. Louis Blues. Adapting the African American folk idiom to European conventions of orchestration and harmony, Handy produced a hit song. The St. Louis Blues was tremendously influential among black and white musicians, and Handy's style of music became famous under the name of jazz. Early jazz musicians were active in many cities and towns throughout the southern United States. It was New Orleans, with its long tradition of African American music, that was the home of many fathers of jazz. After World War I, the musicians of New Orleans joined the general northward migration of African Americans. The first great national center of jazz was Chicago. From there, the music entered the mainstream and even gave its name to the decade.
I think it's often underestimated the connection between doing research, live research, and teaching undergraduates and the undergraduate programs. Because, of course, if you're working at CERN on a frontier experiment, you come back to give a lecture, you're buzzing with activity of what's going on, your new results. It just makes the whole lecture much more interesting for students. It's always really exciting to look ahead at new science and what might happen in the future. I must say, lots depends on what we find in the next few years at the start of the Large Hadron Collider. We are expecting to find very many new phenomena. So the thing we'll want to be building in 10 years' time will depend on what we find.
Now that story's been scotched as only part of contingency planning, but it was a symptom of the dramatic turn of events in South Australia, and it flushed out other remarks from water academics and people like Tim Flannery, indicating that things were really much worse than had been foreshadowed even earlier this year. So is Adelaide, let alone some whole regions of South Australia, in serious bother, considering that the vast amount of its drinking water comes from the beleaguered Murray, something many of us outside the state may not have quite realized. Is their predicament something we have to face up to as a nation?
This is one thing we can say about babies. Human babies compared to babies of other species is that we are entirely dependent on our carers to bring us up and for us to survive. And so it's very important for babies to get into relationships with somebody who's going to look after them well. So, biology has meant that babies and the adults are geared up to be in relationship with each other from the start.
The question that most people want to ask at this point is, how do we speed up the transition? If it's a good idea to have fewer people in the world, which may or may not be the case, then how might we move towards a situation in which population growth rates are reduced? How might we speed up the transition, the demographic transition that I've talked about? And I think there are probably 4 kinds of answers. I'm not going to suggest that all the kinds of answers, but those are the most obvious ones.
Bruch and her colleague Mark Newman studied who swapped messages with whom on a popular online dating platform in the month of January 2014. They categorized users by desirability using PageRank, one of the algorithms behind search technology. Essentially, if you receive a dozen messages from desirable users, you must be more desirable than someone who receives the same number of messages from average users. Then they asked, how far out of their league do online daters tend to go when pursuing a partner? I think people are optimistic realists. In other words, they found that both men and women tended to pursue mates just 25% more desirable than themselves. So they're being optimistic, but they're also taking into account their own relative position within this overall desirability hierarchy. All the graphs and charts are in the journal Science Advances, and the study did have a few more lessons for people on the market. I think one of the take-home messages from this study is that women could probably afford to be more aspirational in their mate pursuit.
Parents and other adults with whom children have close contact have a powerful influence on children's food preferences. Children are very sensitive to the reactions of those around them, and if they see others enjoying a particular food, they will be inclined more favourably towards that food. Thus, if parents want to persuade their children to eat more vegetables, then rather than simply telling them what to eat, it's more effective to demonstrate that they themselves Let's see what's happening on the seabed. Okay, so these really remarkable features are known as black smokers. Don't forget, we're now 2.5 kilometres down. The light, it's all pitch black. What we're seeing is the lights from the submersible. So imagine you're looking at this out from your porthole, and it supports Hiroshi Ishiguro, a robot engineer from Osaka University, makes Geminoids, extremely realistic human robots. It's important that they look exactly like real people for Ishiguro to carry out his research. He's interested in understanding philosophical questions such as what is identity, and what might happen if a person and their robot double were able to be in two places at the same time. His Geminoid robots have rubber skin and their heads are controlled by motors. These move the head, blink, twitch, shrug the shoulders, and make the robot appear to be breathing during conversations. As well as this, there are motors which are connected to a computer, microphone, and camera. These scan the controller's voice and face movements, then send messages back to the robot, which copies them. The robot's body and skin stop at his chest, though, and he has no robotic legs, so you won't see him.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Steve Mirsky. Got a minute? The Nobel Prize in Chemistry goes to three men who revolutionized molecular life science, Japan's Osamu Shimomura and Americans Martin Chalfie and Roger Tseng. They developed tools to light up and see individual proteins inside living cells. These tiny molecular flashlights make it possible to study numerous events that take place in cells and whole organisms that were previously invisible, such as the development of nerve cells or the spread of cancer cells. In 1962, Shimomura, now emeritus professor at the Marine Biological Laboratory at Woods Hole, discovered that jellyfish produce a green fluorescent protein, GFP, that glows when exposed to ultraviolet light. Some 30 years later, Columbia University's Chalfie showed that the GFP gene could be put into any organism. By making sure the fluorescent protein was expressed at the same time as other proteins of interest, researchers could literally light up events they want to follow. Then Tseng at the University of California, San Diego, engineered fluorescent proteins in various colors. The multicolor palette enables researchers to follow multiple biological processes at the same time. Thanks for the minute. For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Steve Mirsky.
New parents can act pretty strangely. For example, they often have an obsessive interest in what comes out of their baby's bottoms. Now researchers at Stanford University join them in their diaper diving to explore when and how bacteria colonize the human gut. Adults harbor complex microbial ecosystems within their GI tracts. These bacteria help digest food and contribute to a healthy immune system. But when a baby's born, its intestine is devoid of bacterial inhabitants. Within days, however, a cavalcade of microbes set up shop, establishing a vibrant intestinal community whose residents soon outnumber the baby's own cells. The researchers found that the early months were chaotic, with established species disappearing and new ones taking their place. But by the time the babies were 12 months old, each harbored a dynamic but unique collection of intestinal fauna. A set of fraternal twins had the most similar bugs, which suggests that genetics may have something to do with which bacteria stick around. Next, I'll look at how formula versus breast milk affects a baby's intestinal ecosystem. With so many questions left to explore, the researchers will no doubt be mining diapers for some time to come.
You will take your uniform on the first day.
New credit cards will soon use fingerprint technology. Calculators may not be used in the examination.
The students will meet their new teachers after the summer vacation.
We should have a meeting to discuss and report. Please move us to the meeting room for the next hour.
Restrooms are down the entrance and to the right.